Okay, let's unpack this. We've received a fascinating snapshot of a major cultural debate, one that's really been raging across the internet. And it specifically targets the publishing industry and how gender influences what we read.
Or maybe what we choose not to read.
Exactly. Or, perhaps more accurately, what entire demographics choose not to engage with, at least in the traditional formats view.
Right.
The core of this deep dive is to investigate a viral, and I have to say, a frankly quite provocative claim.
Oh, absolutely.
It was made by an activist regarding men, fiction, and human empathy, a debate that pits, cultural critique against some very hard market.
And this deep dive is absolutely crucial. I mean, it's so important because it touches on not just literary taste, but these massive cultural trends.
Right.
We're talking about market disruption on a global scale, and really some fundamental philosophical beliefs about gender, about character development, and even about the purpose of storytelling itself.
Yeah.
So we're examining a whole stack of source material that contains claims ranging from highly specific, almost statistical observations about submission rates in traditional publishing.
All the way to these sweeping, generalized accusations about human nature.
Exactly. Our goal is to synthesize these points and really find out where the actual, consumption of narrative is happening today.
And the catalyst claim, the one that sparked this entire inferno of a debate, and which we really have to address head on, was a statement made by a feminist activist on the social media platform. The core argument was a simple but brutal correlation. Men's hate for fiction is directly correlated to them.
It's a heavy statement.
It's not just a critical review of reading habits. That is a fundamental moral condemnation.
Indeed. And that initial statement immediately sets up this massive core conflict that, it runs through so much of the modern literary discussion.
It does.
On one side, you have the assertion that women writers are somehow inherently more connected with emotional intelligence, with empathy, and that allows them to write better characters, better, more emotionally resonant fiction.
And this isn't a new idea, is it?
Not at all. The source material suggests this has allegedly been discussed, sometimes tacitly, behind the scenes in professional writing circles for years.
Okay.
But the counter-argument, which really dominates our source material today, is that men haven't abandoned fiction at all. Not even close.
They've just gone elsewhere.
They've simply moved their consumption, and by the way, their $200 billion worth of spending, to other massive and entirely different markets.
So our mission today is pretty comprehensive. We need to analyze the claims about market dominance and the alleged collapse and content shifts within traditional print publishing.
Right. And then we have to scrutinize that empathy argument using the source's very detailed counter-critique of the cultural consistency or lack thereof.
But I think most importantly, we need to dedicate significant time to investigating specific hard evidence provided. We're talking about the mass exodus and the subsequent shifts to these gargantuan markets like video games, anime, and the burgeoning independent publishing community.
We are looking for the reality of where the reading audience actually went.
Let's start at the source of the shockwave then. We really need to focus on the provocative nature of this empathy claim, which the source material lays out in incredible detail, and the specific debate it triggered across, the entire publishing world and social media.
The initial X post itself is, it's quite blunt. It feels like it was designed to provoke a strong reaction.
It certainly did that.
The specific accusation posits that if men don't care about stories for other people, and the source interprets that phrase as stories that fall outside a very narrow self-referential scope, often focusing on domestic or social drama, then the implication is that they only care about themselves. This lack of interest in what they call external narratives in traditional forms is then translated directly and uncompromising into them being devoid of empathy.
And the activists clearly intended for this to be a comprehensive critique of taste. It was books.
No, not at all. In a subsequent post, they extended this analysis far beyond just book, claiming this deficit translates to men's general artistic taste across all media.
How so? What were the examples?
They claimed this lack of engagement with certain narratives could be proven because, allegedly, so many men can't name 3 female artists they listen to. Or, and this is maybe more telling, that men only enjoy movies that are far removed from their realm of existence.
Far removed from their realm of... That phrase seems really important.
It's critical to unpack because it highlights the activists' specific definition of what they consider high-value art. Their line of reasoning concluded that men are missing out on amazing art just because you don't personally relate.
So the underlying assumption is that the value of art is rooted in personal, immediate, emotional relatability.
Exactly. And that rejecting that specific type of art is therefore a moral failure.
And this is where the source material unleashes its first major counter-critique. The source characterizes this entire claim that a lack of engagement with traditional empathy-focused content proves a lack of empathy as extreme projection.
Yes.
Why that word specifically? Why projection?
Well, the source argues that the criteria used by the activists to define a lack of empathy, so caring only about self-related stories and having a limited artistic range, ironically describes the very behavior the source believes the mainstream literary culture often exhibits.
So they're turning it right back around.
They are. The source suggests it describes how certain segments of the audience, often female, or even the industry itself, act a lot of the time, not men.
So if the rule is that you have to consume content outside your own realm of existence to prove empathy,
Then the sources ask, is the industry itself actually promoting that kind of consumption? Or is it heavily focused on creating content that serves an increasingly narrow, self-referential, and specific set of experiences?
it's a really striking turning of the table. The source is arguing that the accuser is basically describing their own behavior, or at least the industry's structural preferences. So the very premise of the original post, that a preference for, say, genre fiction or a lack of engagement with mainstream print fiction indicates a fundamental empathetic failure, is what the entire ensuing debate sought to dismantle.
And it used market data as its chief weapon to do so.
Right.
And what's truly fascinating here is the alleged double standard regarding relatability that the source material meticulously highlights.
Okay, let's get into that.
The source connects the activist critique of men's alleged inability to relate to art, the demand that they must consume stories far removed from their own existence, with the alleged publishing trend that has dominated the industry for the last 2 decades.
You're referring to the major, sustained cultural and commercial push for representation past.
Exactly. The source argues that during this very same period, mainstream fiction has heavily centered on the demand that marginalized people need to be represented.
Right, that's been a huge conversation.
And the source illustrates this demand through paraphrased examples, suggesting the prevailing sentiment is something like, I need to see me as a black, lesbian, disabled person in this fiction, or I don't get it whatsoever.
Okay.
And this creates a profound structural inconsistency, which the source directly calls the irony of relatability.
Let's break down that irony, because that's a powerful concept. So if the source's description of the mainstream publishing demand is accurate, we have one group demanding hyper-specific, immediate, identity-based relatability as a prerequisite for engaging with and validating fiction. Yet, at the same time, when the male audience allegedly chooses to disengage from that traditional content, maybe because they don't relate to it or because it just doesn't align with their tastes in genre, they are instantly accused of an empathy deficit.
Precisely. The source argues that the industry cannot logically maintain both of those positions simultaneously. It's a contradiction.
It is.
If the purpose of literature is to foster empathy by reading outside your lived experience, then demanding hyper-specific representation actually works against that goal.
But on the other hand,
If the purpose is validation through representation, then criticizing a reader for seeking content that validates their experience, which for many men might mean action or complexity or world building, is hypocritical.
so the source concludes that the industry has chosen the path of validation and representation for certain groups.
And in doing so, they've lost the moral high ground to criticize men for seeking out fiction that relates to their interests in other formats.
This structural inconsistency, as detailed in the source, it suggests the critique is less about empathy and maybe more about cultural control over the traditional narrative.
It seems to lean that way.
Furthermore, the source discusses an allegation of active boycotting within the genre space itself.
Right, this is another major point.
They claim, citing ongoing community discussions, that female authors have actively called for boycotting white male authors in the genre.
Which is an action the source notes is notably not reciprocated by male authors calling to boycott female authors.
So it's presented as a one-way street.
That allegation pushes the conversation from just taste to, professional conduct and even market manipulation. The source suggests this indicates that the conflict is not simply one of literary preference.
It's systemic.
It's systemic and at times actively aggressive, a pushback designed to reshape the entire professional writing community. The source suggests a very real, one-sided cultural skirmish has taken place in the gatekeeping layers of publishing.
And that would contribute significantly to men's general feeling of being unwelcome or even targeted within that traditional publishing space.
Absolutely. And it would accelerate their exodus to alternative markets.
This debate isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening within a structurally challenged book industry.
Very challenging.
So given the alleged political and philosophical shifts we just discussed, let's look at how the source claims this has structurally changed the traditional market itself, leading to what they view as a market collapse over the last couple of decades.
The source material provides a clear decades-long timeline regarding the structure of the traditional industry, particularly concerning its demographics.
Okay.
Their observation is that the book industry has been increasingly dominated by women over the last 20 years. And this alleged shift, it spans not just readership, but critically, the gatekeeping roles.
So the agents, the editors.
The agents, the editors, the marketing departments, the people responsible for content acquisition and promotion.
And the observable evidence of this, according to the source, is purely visual and spatial. It gives you something tangible to connect to the claim. The observation is that if you physically go to any major book section, a Barnes & Noble, the Target book aisle, any major retail display, you will quickly see that everything out there is just women.
It's framed as a literal physical market visibility issue.
Yeah, where content that historically catered to a male readership is simply absent, or it's marginalized, or hidden away on some obscure back shelf.
And this alleged demographic dominance in both production and selection, the source claims, has a direct, measurable correlation to overall market.
To the bottom line.
To the bottom line. They state that this narrow focus has led to demonstrably sagging book sales in the traditional print sense. And why? Because the male audience is pretty much tuned out of reading entirely.
And the source argues this wasn't an accident. It wasn't just an oversight.
No, they suggest it was the consequence of prioritizing cultural and demographic goals over broad commercial viability.
Let's pause on the market dynamics there, because this is where the critique really starts to intersect with economics.
It is.
If the industry prioritizes content for a single demographic, even if that demographic buys more books per capita, if they ignore the massive potential of the male consumer, who traditionally dominated high-volume genre fiction,
then the overall market size has to shrink. It's just math.
It's just math.
Exactly. The logical extension of this argument is that by focusing so heavily on one demographic and often pushing content that specifically alienates or excludes another, the industry has essentially sacrificed its broad market appeal and its financial stability.
So the source views this not as a temporary slump, but a structural collapse.
A structural collapse from which traditional publishers are now trying to deflect blame by attacking the character of the exiting readers.
Which brings us right back to the lack of empathy claims.
Precisely.
The source even explicitly says this structural collapse is why they and their contemporaries are focused on building something new and doing something independently away from the mainstream publishing.
They're implying that the traditional market is structurally unfixable in its current form.
Why?
Because the gatekeepers are unwilling or unable to pivot back to broad genre appeal. They've, in a sense, painted themselves into a corner.
So to understand why men allegedly tuned out, we have to scrutinize the source's highly critical view of the type of content they claim is being pushed by.
Yes, particularly within science fiction and fantasy.
Which are genres that historically served as a primary consumption avenue for men interested in, complex world building and action.
And the source argues that the material being pushed into these genres now is so ridiculous, it fundamentally lacks the high concept storytelling traditionally associated with.
And the source uses specific, and I have to say very striking and highly inflammatory examples to illustrate this alleged editorial shift.
They do.
And we must be clear here. We're reporting on the source's characterization, not endorsing the judgment itself. One example they cited was the book Morning Glory Milking Farm.
The source describes this book very graphic, focusing on the premise, which they say involves a woman with a, monster cow.
A monster cow.
Yes, and they use extremely strong language to describe this shift, characterizing this specific subject matter as disgusting and arguing that this is the type of material being pushed into the fantasy and science fiction genres ad nauseum by traditional publishers.
So the source's interpretation of this content shift is, it's safe to say, highly critical.
It is. They argue that this editorial focus is all about weird fetishes and that there is, in their words, nothing empathetic or interesting about that from a universal storytelling perspective.
And this leads to their very harsh conclusion regarding how the market is even sustaining itself.
That conclusion is that this type of print is essentially porn, but for women, who are, as the source states, feelings-oriented rather than visually-oriented, which leads them to prefer reading print erotica over looking at visual pornography.
So the source is stating bluntly that this type of content is the only thing propping up fantasy and science fiction books at this point in the mainstream.
It's a profound structural accusation. They're arguing that the literary genre market is being sustained by niche erotica disguised as genre fiction rather than by the world-building epics of the past.
And to reinforce this point about editorial shifts, they provide another example of controversial content allegedly being published by traditional outlets. Harry Potter fan fictions involving Hermione and Draco Malfoy having a sordid and graphic affair.
And the source asks rhetorically, why would a traditional male reader, someone who might be interested in military sci-fi or political thrillers or epic world building, why would they want to consume that kind of?
It's a fair question from there.
They suggest these examples demonstrate a clear editorial pivot, replacing traditional genre themes like exploration, military strategy, or technological advance, with themes focused almost exclusively on niche sexual or domestic relationship dynamics.
And this editorial pivot, the source concludes, is the primary content-driven engine that's driving men away from traditional print.
Right. They didn't stop reading fiction. They just stopped reading that fiction.
This segment pivots from the allegations of traditional publishing collapse to the primary counter-evidence that, according to the source, completely destroyed the initial narrative.
This is where it gets really interesting.
If men aren't reading books, the undeniable question becomes, where are they? And what are they consuming? Here's where we move from cultural critique to massive economic reality.
The most immediate and quantifiable rebuttal to the activists' initial claim came in the form of a community note on X, which acted as a direct, data-driven fact check. The note directly challenged the premise that men hate fiction.
So what did it say?
It argued that the evidence points to a massive relocation of consumption, not an abandonment of storytelling.
Okay, a relocation.
The note identified men's primary consumption center as the two biggest fiction markets on the planet. And when we talk biggest, we mean gargantuan markets.
Which are?
Video games and anime manga light novel. This shift isn't about moving from one type of book to another. It's about moving from print media to entirely new, often interactive, industrial narrative ecosystem.
Let's talk about the scale, because this is the data point that fundamentally changes the nature of the content.
It really does. The source provided a hard number that truly puts the traditional book market into perspective. Global gaming revenue is estimated at a staggering $200 billion annually.
$200 billion with a B.
With a B. And the source emphasizes that this figure is dwarfing books and films combined.
Wow.
Furthermore, this is critical, the audience for this gargantuan industry remains statistically majority male.
$200 billion annually. That is an undeniable statistical reality. It immediately, and I would say definitively, undermines the claim of men being devoid of empathy or having a hate for fiction.
You don't achieve that kind of revenue with consumers who lack interest in stories. It's impossible.
So the logical conclusion drawn from this massive data point is that men haven't stopped consuming fiction at all.
They've just moved their tastes into areas away from this nonsense that they're promoting in the mainstream public.
This shift represents a structural change in the very delivery mechanism of narrative.
Absolutely. Traditional publishing, dealing primarily in prose and print, is now just one small, shrinking slice of the overall fiction pie.
And we have to analyze the complexity of this new delivery system. I mean, many of these digital narratives are incredibly long form.
Oh, massive. Think about complex MMO or lengthy narrative JRPGs or an expansive 50-volume manga. These formats often require far greater cognitive and temporal investment in world building and character engagement than a standard 300-page novel.
That's a great point. The fact that the largest narrative markets are interactive or visual markets which demand engagement directly contradicts the idea that men reject stories or lack the attention span for complex narratives.
And the example of Warhammer 40K is perfect here.
Right.
It's not just a game. It's a vast, deeply complex, century-spanning fictional universe supported by hundreds of novels, rulebooks, video games.
Engaging with that world requires immense dedication and knowledge. It's a serious commitment.
Absolutely. And the consumption model also differs dramatically. Buying a book is often a single transaction, right?
Sure.
Gaming revenue, however, is often ongoing. It involves subscriptions, microtransact, continual content.
Which indicates a far deeper and more continuous commitment to a fictional universe than just casual.
That's it, exactly. The level of sustained engagement with worlds like Final Fantasy or Destiny is a testament to the fact that men are passionate, dedicated consumers of narrative complexity.
They just prefer that complexity to be interactive or highly cinematic.
Rather than focused on literary character studies in prose format, the preference is for the medium, not a rejection of the story.
And to really drive this point home, to prove the source's argument that men are avid fiction consumers, the material provided this extensive and really diverse list of franchises and properties that men actively consume across all media.
Yeah, the list is crucial.
It illustrates the sheer scope of their...
It really does. And it proves that the genre preferences of the male audience are extremely broad and deep, covering everything from high fantasy epics to gritty historical westerns and dark futuristic thrillers.
What were some of the big names on there?
Well, the specific franchises cited include cultural monoliths that have defined global storytelling for decades. Things like Star Wars, Star Trek, Dune, and The Lord of the Rings.
So the absolute titans of the genre.
Titans. And these are not simple stories. They're narratives built on geopolitical conflict, philosophical depth, and massive historical scope.
And the list continues, right? It cites dedicated world-building franchises like Warhammer 40K, which we just mentioned.
And the entire comic book industry, including comic book and the ubiquitous comic book movies that, dominate global cinema today.
It also mentions action-oriented properties. I remember seeing the Jack Reacher novels and films.
Jack Reacher, adventure characters like Indiana Jones. These exemplify complex action-adventure narratives.
And moving specifically into the digital realm.
We have narrative-heavy video game franchises cited like Cyberpunk, Red Dead Redemption, which is a highly acclaimed narrative experience that focuses on character moral decline.
Right.
Alongside more action-focused properties like Call of Duty and the massively multiplayer world of Destiny.
The source also mentions specific films and literary examples known for complex or dark themes, like American Psycho and Blade,
which demonstrates an appetite for morally ambiguous or challenging concepts.
And they tie in classics, too, citing works like The Odyssey, alongside modern young adult fiction that requires a major time, Percy Jackson and Harry Potter.
Yes, and the list even included diverse films like Cesario, The Nice Guys, and Step Brother, which illustrates that this consumption applies across the entire spectrum of media, provided the content hits their thematic interest.
The sheer volume and diversity of that list, from ancient Greek epics to modern military shooters, is intended to be overwhelming counter to the lack of empathy.
And that leads us to the crucial implication of this whole section.
Which is?
When you look at the breadth of that consumption, we have to ask, does a clear preference for action-oriented, world-building, high-concept science fiction, or historical, as opposed to romance, erotica, or domestic drama, truly signify a lack of empathy?
Or does it simply signify a difference in preferred narrative delivery system and thematics?
The data from the $200 billion gaming industry strongly suggests the latter. Men are engaged in narrative, deeply engaged.
But their tastes are aligned with complex, long-form fiction consumed digitally, interactively, or visually,
rather than the print content currently prioritized by the traditional publishing. The problem, according to this evidence, is one of format and content alignment, not moral failure.
Okay, so moving from these large macroeconomic market statistics, let's drill down into the direct experiences of writers.
Right from the ground up.
How independent publishing is actively filling the gap left by the mainstream industry's alleged focus. This is about seeing the shift from the perspective of the creators, not just the consumer.
The initial X post generated intense backlash, and not just from anonymous users. It came from established, financially successful working authors whose careers directly contradict the activist narrative of male apathy.
These voices provided specific, blunt responses that are rooted in their daily sales. They have
the receipts. One of the most prominent responses cited was from Larry Correa, a New York Times bestselling novelist.
Okay.
The source details his impressive credentials: 33 books written, millions of copies sold worldwide, and most importantly, the majority of his readers are men.
And his response was?
His direct and, frankly, visceral response to the activist was simply calling her a effing idiot. This is the voice of a professional who sees the activist's claim dismantled every single time he checks his royalty statement.
And other authors echoed this sentiment, right? They challenged the claim as an outright fabrication.
They did. John A. Douglas, the novelist behind Black Crown, bluntly replied, "Yeah, all just exploitive lie."
The source also includes the reactions of female authors who rejected,
which is a crucial point. People like Katie Room, who stated, "I think I sprained something rolling my eyes so hard when reading this."
The fact that successful female writers are also rejecting the narrative of male fiction apathy adds further weight to the idea that this isn't a gender truth, but an industry-wide structural problem rooted in maybe editorial blindness.
I think that's the argument, yes.
We also have crucial personal sales data provided as counterproof. Authors whose livelihoods depend on their readership are confirming that men are still avid fiction readers.
Mrs. Ollie, another cited author, stated, "I write and read fiction all the time, so do my friends. You're full of it. My book sales prove men are still avid fiction readers. The key point here is the emphasis on sale."
Right. It's not an opinion, it's a transaction.
And the source host himself provides highly specific, verifiable data from his own publishing experience, which perfectly illustrates the viability of the independent market as a kind of counter-economy.
What were his numbers?
He claims that 90% of his fiction market consists of men, proving they are eager to consume content not published by the mainstream industry, provided it aligns with their interests.
90%. That's a huge data point that validates the existence of this overlooked market.
It is. Furthermore, he provided specific annual sales figures to support the viability of this independent ecosystem, claiming to have sold over 8,000 books last year across his 25-plus written novels.
And that performance supports the argument that when men find content they want, content focused on action, world building, complex theme, they consume it enthusiastically, entirely circumventing the traditional corporate gatekeepers. But we need to understand the mechanism. I mean, how is that level of sales viable without a corporate publisher behind you?
That is the core of the independent revolution. Authors bypass the traditional publishing model, which often offers, very low royalty rates.
It's something like 15% or even less.
Sometimes less than 15% of the list price, and with long lead time. Independent authors selling directly or through platforms like Amazon KDP, they control their pricing, their marketing, and they receive vastly higher royalty split, often 70%.
So selling 8,000 books independently can actually be significantly more profitable than selling, say, 30,000 copies through a major house.
By a huge margin.
Yeah.
They're leveraging direct marketing, newsletters, fan communities. They're replacing the expensive and often ineffective marketing departments of the major houses.
So they're building these microeconomies focused intensely on reader satisfaction,
which the mainstream system, according to the source, failed to provide.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source provides critical context on the alleged institutional issues driving this divide within traditional publishing, suggesting a systemic bias that preceded and arguably caused the decline.
The source argues that the decline in traditional publishing started first in specialized fields, specifically short fiction publishing, which they say died a long time ago.
The magazines.
The magazines, yes. This collapse in short fiction, which is the testing ground for new authors, was followed by the mainstream traditional publishing collapse discussing.
So why does short fiction matter so much in this context?
Because it often demonstrates the earliest editorial biases and preference. It's the canary in the coal mine, so to speak.
And this leads us to a highly detailed, and I have to say explosive statistic mentioned in this.
It is.
A statistic that the host had previously researched and published showing a profound skew in gate.
Yes. The host's research allegedly showed that women had 10-to-1 odds of getting their stories published compared to men when submitting to these major professional short fiction.
10-to-1. That's not just a preference.
No. That statistic, if it's accurate, suggests that the deck was structurally stacked against male writers attempting to enter the market for new ideas and new stories.
And the source emphasizes that this wasn't based on genre or quality,
but a profound demographic bias in the selection process itself.
And the source had the methodology and the actual numbers behind them, yet the institutional response to publishing these statistics was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. The host recounts that when they published these figures, the president of the Professional Science Fiction Writers Association responded by calling the host boorish and a bunch of other names, rather than actually addressing the data.
And the source interprets that reaction as evidence that they don't have an answer to this.
So they suggest that the institutional bodies can't refute the data, so they resort to ad hominem attacks.
That's the argument. Their ultimate conclusion on systemic bias is that mainstream publishing is actively driving away male readers and writers by focusing on increasing this feminism more than anything and propping up women rights, often regardless of the content's alignment with traditional genre expectations or broad audience.
So they argue, directly contradicting the mainstream narrative of male privilege, that the current environment quite the opposite.
And that it is this institutional focus that is driving away male readers in general, suggesting that men are being blacklisted from the publishing industry for the sake of diversity.
Which is a profound irony, given the history of the very genres established.
A profound irony.
So given this alleged systemic bias and content alienation, the source describes the active movement toward independent arts as the only viable solution.
The act of rebuilding culture away from mainstream bookstores and large corporations.
They aren't waiting for the old system to fix itself. They're just building a new.
And this is fundamentally about creating a parallel functional ecosystem where the author-reader relationship is direct, bypassing the gatekeepers entirely. This movement is a response to that feeling of abandonment we talked about.
If the traditional market won't serve the audience, the authors will go directly to that audience. And the source details the community-building efforts that make this independent model work, mentioning the specific resources being built, like newsletters and private Discord servers.
And these tools are designed explicitly to connect real readers, those interested in traditional genre themes like high fantasy, sci-fi action, and military narratives, with authors who felt ignored or targeted by the traditional corporate structure.
It's an interesting inversion of the market model, isn't it?
It really is.
Instead of relying on a bookstore display or a major review to validate content, the authors use platforms like Kickstarter, Patreon, and Discord to establish direct paying relationships with their dedicated fans.
And this built a resilient financial model that is entirely separate from the corporate publishing cycle responsible for those sagging book sales.
And the success of this independent approach is validated by the real-world anecdotes provided by the authors working in this new model. The source highlights the female author, Watcher of the Damned, a science fiction writer, who noted that approximately 75% of her readers are...
Her experience serves as a powerful, non-gendered rebuttal to the initial X claim. She states that if writers simply write good stories that challenge and uplift, men will read them, regardless of the author's gender.
Her success in the independent market seems to prove two things, then.
What are they?
First, that the male audience is ready and eager to spend money on fiction, and second, that the problem is not a male hate for fiction or a lack of empathy,
but the content being pushed by the established corporate system. The solution, for many, is simply to build their own distribution network.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We started with a bold, viral claim linking men's fiction consumption to a profound lack of empathy, and we ended up in a detailed dive into the $200 billion...
and the economic viability of the independent market, and the structural biases alleged within traditional publishing.
The summary of market reality seems clear. Fiction consumption is not declining, it is dispersing.
The narrative appetite has simply migrated, moving rapidly, especially into massive digital and interactive format, gaming and anime, which require immense commitment to complex, long-form narrative world.
The claims about men's lack of empathy appear clearly unsupported by the overwhelming evidence of their enthusiasm, massive, narrative-heavy genre franchise.
Franchises that often demand far more time investment and sustained critical thought than a quick novel.
We have clearly identified two parallel ecosystems operating today. On one side, a mainstream traditional market criticized by the source for alleged bias, content narrowed,
where the focus shifted to niche erotica and identity-centric stories,
and consequently driving away a massive traditional demographic.
And conversely, we see a thriving independent market built by authors who felt blacklisted or ignored, which is successfully serving an audience, often primarily male, that felt abandoned by the mainstream gatekeepers, proving the demand is still very much there.
The success of independent authors cited, like Watcher of the Damned, whose readership is 75% male, confirms a critical practice. If writers focus on creating good stories that challenge and uplift, men will eagerly consume them and pay for them directly.
The problem, according to the totality of the source material, lies not in the reader's capacity for empathy or interest, but in the traditional publishing industry's editorial direction, its institutional bias, and its failure to recognize the competition posed by technologically advanced narrative media.
And this brings us to a final provocative thought for you to consider as you step back from this deep dive. If the goal of fiction, as often argued, is truly to build empathy by exposing readers to experience far removed from their realm of existence, how should we evaluate $200 billion complex, character-driven, world-building stories told through interactive or cinematic?
That's the question. If a player spends 100 hours deeply immersed in the moral dilemmas of a game like Red Dead Redemption 2, is that engagement somehow less empathetic than reading a 10-hour?
Is the medium truly the message when it comes to cultural consumption, or are we witnessing a fundamental, technologically driven shift in how different demographics prefer to engage with narrative complexity and build their 21st century?
This is something worth thinking about as you consume your next piece of media, whether it's a book, a game, a streaming show, or an immersive virtual world.